To the left is the tower of the Hebrew University. The university's Mount Scopus campus lies directly below on the ridgeline. The camera is looking south toward the distant hills of Judea and flying along the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives, in reality, is a ridge approximately 2 miles long at an average height of 2,600 feet above sea level. The next tower, directly ahead, marks the Augusta Victoria Hospital. As the helicopter flies over this complex, it turns slightly and, following the ridge, flies over the village of Autur, which sits in a small depression. As David fled from Absalom, he would have passed this way. The third tower, now approaching on the horizon, is the Tower of the Ascension, that identifies a church remembering Jesus' post-resurrection ascent from the Mount of Olives, a location that has been lost in time. After passing over the Tower of Ascension, the southwestern slopes of the ridge come into view, and the massive Jewish cemetery is visible. The Mount of Olives has been a place of burial since before the days of the Israelite kings. Beyond the cemetery is a small tree-covered knoll called the Hill of Corruption. This was the location of a high place built by King Solomon to the idol Chemosh, a heathen deity to which children were sacrificed. It was later destroyed by King Josiah. Hebrew University in Jerusalem has 2 campuses, one in the western part of the city and this one on the Mount of Olives. This campus is known as the Mount Scopus campus, since this northern part of the Mount of Olives ridge is in close proximity with the Mount Scopus mentioned in numerous ancient sources. The cornerstone for the campus was laid in 1918, and it was officially opened in 1925. In the distant haze at the upper right of the screen, the golden dome of the rock, marking the site of the ancient Temple Mount to the southwest of the campus, can be seen. From 1948 to 1967, the campus was an outpost protected by the Israeli army and surrounded by the Jordanians. Since 1967, the campus has been totally rebuilt, and today it is the main campus of the university. Straight ahead and nestled in the woods of the Mount of Olives ridgeline is Augusta Victoria Hospital, with its notable observation tower. The hospital has been in operation since the late 1800s and was originally built by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who visited Jerusalem in 1898 to provide medical care for German pilgrims. It was named after his wife. Subsequently, the campus and building served as a headquarters for the British Mandate. Since 1950, it has again functioned as a hospital under the management of the Lutheran World Federation and serves the medical needs of the Palestinian community. As the helicopter turns to the west, most of the city of Jerusalem comes into view in the distance. The tall buildings on the low ridge identify the business district of West Jerusalem. This small mosque remembers the ascension of Jesus from the Mount of Olives. Luke is the only evangelist to mention the ascension of Jesus, and he places the event on the Mount of Olives in Acts chapter 1, verse 12. This particular location has been venerated since 392, when a small church was built here. The Crusaders rebuilt the church, and an octagon replaced the original circular shape. The site was later conveyed to Muslim ownership by Saladin, who rebuilt it, retaining much of the Crusader architecture, but added a roof. It has remained in Muslim possession ever since. Inside of the mosque, an impression on the rock floor is venerated as the mark of Jesus' feet. The camera pans around the beautiful spire of the convent of the Russian Church of the Ascension. The first church was built here late in the 4th century. Reconstructed in the late 1870s, the tower was added to provide pilgrims a view of the Jordan River. Taken in the late afternoon, this view begins with a northeasterly look at the large cemetery on the southern end of the Mount of Olives ridge, with the rest of the ridge and the tower of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Ascension visible in the background. The Seven Arches Hotel is on the top of the hill. The concentration of cemeteries, Christian and Jewish, here on the slopes at the southwestern end of the Mount of Olives, is due to the belief that the Kidron Valley is the Valley of Jehoshaphat, where it is written that humanity will assemble to be judged by God. Jesus, while visiting Jerusalem, may have pointed at these graves from the temple across the valley and made his statement likening some of the Pharisees to whitewashed tombs. In the distance are the chalky hills of the Judean wilderness and the Judean hills near Bethlehem. The view begins on the east side of the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles from Jerusalem, as the helicopter flies low over a modern village near ancient Bethany. Continuing westward, the distinctive tower of the Russian Church of the Ascension is seen, as well as the entire Mount of Olives ridgeline, south to north. Moving west, a lovely panoramic vista of the city of Jerusalem unfolds. The golden dome of the rock, marking the ancient Temple Mount, is readily visible, as are the tall buildings of the more modern section of the city, known today as West Jerusalem. This beautiful structure is a church named Dominus Flavit. In Latin, Dominus Flavit means the Lord wept, and the church commemorates a traditional site at which it is said the event, as recorded in Luke chapter 19, verse 41, occurred. Luke records that once when Jesus approached the city of Jerusalem, he wept. Medieval pilgrims were the first to designate a rock here as the place where Jesus may have been when he mourned over Jerusalem's future. Designed by the Italian architect Barlucci, this church building was built in 1955 and is appropriately shaped like a teardrop. With the camera moving north along the base of the Mount of Olives, the Church of All Nations, with its many-domed roof, comes into view on the right side of the road. It is here that tradition places Jesus praying just prior to his arrest. To the left of the church is a small grove of olive trees, remembered today as Gethsemane, which means literally the place of the olive press. Thus, the garden to which the Gospel refers was probably an olive grove. Archaeological artifacts indicate the present location was a place for the manufacture of olive oil. The church, also called the Church of the Agony, was built in 1924 and designed by the Italian architect Barlucci. This clip shows Jerusalem as seen from the south. At the top center are the 3 towers that identify the Mount of Olives. Separating the Mount of Olives ridge from the city itself is the Kidron Valley. The ancient Temple Mount is marked by the gold dome of the Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock. At the bottom of the screen, the Hinnom Valley curls westward around the southern part of the city. The southwest corner of the Old City, known today as Mount Zion, comes into view in the lower left corner as the clip concludes. Viewed from almost directly above, the ridge on which the city of David was constructed is in the sun at the bottom right of the screen. It is the oldest and original section of Jerusalem. The shadow marks the Kidron Valley that separates the city of David to the west on the right from the village of Silwan to the east on the left. The helicopter slowly circles over the heights above Silwan and a wooded green area assumed to be the Hill of Corruption in 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 13, can be seen at the bottom of the screen. This hill had high places for pagan worship, established by King Solomon for his foreign wives. The entire modern city of Jerusalem is now seen from southwest to northeast. This clip begins high above a spur of land seen in the middle of the screen that was the ancient city of Jebus, taken by David, and later to be called Jerusalem. The Jebusite city was built on this narrow ridge, around which the camera circles, because the only source of groundwater was from a spring, the Gihon, located on the eastern slope, left and above the paved road near the long terraces. Most scholars believe this location was Salem, where Abraham met and offered tithes to the king Melchizedek, probably in the deep Kidron Valley, near the Gihon Spring. The steep sides of the ridge required homes to be built close together, as alluded to in Psalm 122. The ridge is surrounded by higher hills, mentioned by David in Psalms 121 and 125, including the Hill of Offense, seen at the top of the screen. The clip ends over the ancient city, looking south along the Kidron Valley, and a wadi that eventually leads to the Dead Sea. The camera begins by looking south over the narrow ridge of Jebus and the city of David. As the clip progresses, the helicopter swings over the Kidron Valley and swoops down to view the eastern side of the ridge in the bright sunlight. The excavated areas above the road at the bottom right have revealed buildings dating to a time before David captured the city. The entrance to the Gihon Spring is located near where the bus is parked. The light brown soil of the excavations generally shows the extent of the early city. The camera then turns to show a higher hill to the north and the walls of the modern old city. Protruding above the walls is a gray dome marking the top of the hill where Solomon built the first temple. Seen clearly at this point are the whole ridge, Kidron Valley, and in the distance, the location of the Temple Mount. The gray-domed church in this close-up aerial is the Church of St. Peter in Galligantu, or St. Peter at Cockcrow. The site remembers Peter's denial of Jesus at the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. The church was built in 1931 on the slopes of modern Mount Zion, on the site of an earlier Byzantine church. Archaeological excavations conducted prior to the building of the present church uncovered interesting rock-cut structures, cellars, cisterns, and stables dating to the time of Jesus. Surrounding the building are other excavated areas. Next to the church is a terraced street from the time of Jesus. It connected the lower, poorer part of Jerusalem to the upper, wealthy section of town, home to the temple aristocracy. High above the southern extent of Jerusalem, the camera provides a panoramic view of the city. The Mount of Olives, with its 3 distinctive towers, is seen on the horizon. In the shadow of the lower part of the screen is the Hinnom Valley, curving around the southern edge of a section of the city known today as Mount Zion. The camera slows to provide a wonderful view of Mount Zion, with the gray dome and spire of the Church of the Dormition. On the left of the screen, gleaming in the evening sunlight, in the heart of the city, is the Golden Dome of the Rock, marking where Solomon built the first temple and the location of the second temple in Jesus' day. The prominent structure capped by a conical dome is the Church of the Dormition. The Wall of Jerusalem and Zion Gate can be seen behind the church complex. This church commemorates where, according to early tradition, Jesus' mother, Mary, died. The low rectangular building houses 2 traditional sites. On the lower floor is the traditional location of the Tomb of David. On the second floor, Christian pilgrims remember Jesus' Last Supper and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. The building, however, was part of a Crusader church dating only to the 12th century. This lovely view is of the illuminated dome and area around the Church of the Dormition on Mount Zion. The church is traditionally considered to be where Mary, Jesus' mother, died. The southwestern wall of the Old City, constructed by Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century A.D., is in the background. This panorama of Old Jerusalem begins by viewing the city from the south. The golden dome in the upper center of the scene helps identify where the temple stood in Jesus' day. In the foreground is the city's wall, constructed in the 16th century A.D. by Suleiman the Magnificent. Moving along the western wall, the remains of Herod's palace comes into view. Just to the right of a large opening in the wall, the Jaffa Gate. Behind the Golden Dome are the Mount of Olives and Garden of Gethsemane. Coming into view on the left in the city is a small gray dome near a higher church spire. The gray dome is part of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that marks the traditional site of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. Panning out from the golden dome that marks the location of the Temple Mount in Jesus' day, the camera gives us this spectacular view of the old city of Jerusalem at night. The illuminated southern wall is seen next, and then the camera begins to move north along the western wall. In the distance, the lights on the Mount of Olives can be seen, and two of its towers are highlighted. The old city bustles with evening traffic around the Jaffa Gate, and the clip ends with the helicopter west of the old city, near the David Citadel Hotel, formerly the Hilton, the building with the lighted roof. The old city of Jerusalem is divided into 4 quarters or ethnic neighborhoods. The Jewish quarter is seen here. In 1948, the Herva synagogue was destroyed in the fierce fighting that expelled most of the Jewish residents. After 1967, the Jewish residents returned and the area rebuilt. The reconstructed arch of the Herva is in the center and is all that remains of the once magnificent synagogue. This view is of the old city from the west. On the skyline is a tower identifying the Mount of Olives. The Golden Dome is where the Temple Mount was located. Between the Mount of Olives and the Golden Dome is the Kidron Valley and Garden of Gethsemane. Seen along the wall are the Jaffa Gate, and to its right, Herod's Palace. In the distance are the hills of the Judean wilderness, and beyond, the Jordan Valley. The clip concludes with a stunning view looking southeast over the city from the northwest corner of the old city walls. The building with the tower is the West Jerusalem YMCA, and the rectangular-shaped building is the King David Hotel. The helicopter flies east, approaching and above the wall of the old city. Turning over the Jaffa Gate, the rectangular walls of the Herodian Palace to its right, the camera points directly at the commanding Golden Dome of the Rock, the location of the temple in Jesus' time. It then zooms in on a plaza in front of a wall of the Temple Mount, a place of Jewish prayer for hundreds of years, known as the Western Wall. This close-up view shows the area of the Jaffa Gate, one of 7 entrances through the city wall into the Old City. The Old City Wall was built in the 16th century A.D. by the Ottoman ruler Suleiman the Magnificent. To the right of the gate is a monumental palace built by Herod the Great in the 1st century B.C. At the time of Jesus, this citadel was the residence of the Roman governor Pilate. The wall line extending from the palace to the upper right stands on the line of earlier walls, possibly dating back as far as the time of King Hezekiah in the 8th century B.C. The camera zooms into the heart of the Christian quarter of the Old City and concentrates on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It can be identified by the 2 domed structures and adjacent buildings. Very early Christian tradition remembered the site as Golgotha, the place of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The compact nature of the modern city, with its narrow, crowded streets, is apparent. As it is seen today, the church dates mostly from the 12th century Crusader period. Archaeology has established, however, that at the time of Christ, this area was an unused stone quarry outside the walls of the city. This clip begins with a close look at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the helicopter circles east and then south of the complex. The large gray dome of the church was built over a monument revered as the traditional location of Jesus' tomb. The small plaza in the shadow of the church is where pilgrims enter the complex. To the right of the big dome is a smaller one over a Crusader church and near a rock outcropping that tradition suggests was Calvary. The helicopter circles to the west of the church and provides a panoramic view of the Christian and Muslim quarters of the old city. The golden roof of the Dome of the Rock, where the temple in Jesus' day was located, comes into view. The square walls surrounding the Dome of the Rock outline the Temple Mount, a massive structure built by Herod the Great to hold the temple and outer courtyards. Behind the Temple Mount is the Mount of Olives. The helicopter follows along the northern wall of Jerusalem's Old City. From here, the viewer gains an expansive look at the city from the north. The golden dome of the rock on the east side provides a landmark for identifying other places. The area left of the dome is the Muslim quarter. Right of the Muslim quarter and moving off the screen is the Christian quarter and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Behind the Golden Dome is the southern city, the location of the original city of David, and, in the distance, the hills of Judah. As the camera continues to turn, the Jewish quarter of the city is seen in the area to the right of the Dome of the Rock. In the shadows of the city's east wall, the Kidron Valley comes into view. Damascus Gate is the most elaborate of the 7 entrances into the Old City. The present gate is built on earlier ruins that date to the time of King Herod Agrippa I, about 40 to 41 A.D. The small pedestrian gate below and left of the main gate is the excavated remains from the original gate complex. This gate has been rebuilt several times. Most of the visible architecture is from the 16th century. This impressive white limestone complex is the Rockefeller Museum. It is situated across the street from the northeast corner of the Old City in East Jerusalem. The northern wall and northeast corner of the Old City can be seen from time to time during the clip. The museum was opened in 1938 with funds contributed by the Rockefeller family. The collection is based on finds unearthed during the early years of archaeological activity, 1890 to 1948, when British, American, French, and German expeditions began exploring the Holy Land. Despite the difficult conditions, poor roads, and the distance from their homelands, they made important discoveries at key sites such as Jerusalem, Megiddo, Ascalon, Lachish, Samaria, and Jericho. Many of the artifacts uncovered in the country are displayed in this museum. St. Anne's Church and excavations of the Bethesda pools is located in the Muslim quarter, near the Old City's northern wall, visible throughout the clip. The church was first built in the 4th century and completely rebuilt in 1140. The present church preserves much of the Crusader-era edifice. In front of the church, and slightly to the right, is a deep rectangular depression with ruins. These are the remains of the Bethesda pools and later churches built over them. Next to the large pool were smaller pools in Jesus' day, no longer visible, used for washing sheep to be offered as sacrifices in the nearby temple. The camera begins at the northeast corner of the city. Looking south, it then moves along the Old City eastern wall. The Kidron Valley is in the shadow below the large platform supporting the Golden Dome, the location of the Temple Mount in the 1st century. The temple in Jesus' day was where the Islamic dome is, and Herod the Great constructed the platform to contain the temple and its precincts. The camera parallels the Temple Mount's eastern retaining wall, one of the city's oldest walls, dating back to the First Temple period. In the distance can be seen the crowded Old City. At the corner of the Temple Mount, the recently excavated southern wall comes into view. Here, one of the 23-member Sanhedrin courts met. A second met on the Temple Mount, and the third in the temple complex itself. In the days of King Herod the Great, the second temple was rebuilt where the Golden Dome is today. Herod also built a massive platform to support the temple and increase the level area surrounding it. Almost rectangular in shape, Herod's platform is known as the Temple Mount. Archaeological work below the southern wall of the Temple Mount began in 1967. Remains from 3 major periods were uncovered. The square structures surrounded by a wall are the remnants of palace complexes built over 600 years after Jesus. In the sunlight, the western side of the Temple Mount is seen, including the Western Wall Place of Prayer. Here is the southern wall of Herod's Temple Mount, and on the platform, the Islamic Dome of the Rock. On the horizon to the east is the Mount of Olives, with one of its three distinctive towers silhouetted against the skyline. The clip opens with an overhead view of the black dome of the El-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most significant in the Islamic world. The camera then moves out, giving a good overhead view of the lines of the Temple Mount platform. The camera looks at the southwest corner of the platform, and the Temple Mount's Western Wall Plaza comes into view. This has been called the Wailing Wall, as Jews came here to lament the destruction of the temple. The plaza's name was changed after 1967 to something less suggestive of the past and is today a prominent place of worship. Zooming out, the Temple Mount is again visible, along with a part of the adjacent Jewish quarter of the Old City. Flying over the southeastern corner of the Old City, known as the Jewish Quarter, the camera closes in on the Western Wall, a place of Jewish prayer for hundreds of years. This wall is a small section of a wall that supported the Temple Mount platform. It is sacred to religiously observant Jews because it is assumed to be close to where the Holy of Holies of the temple was located. The clip begins with a view of the illuminated Western Wall Plaza. As the camera continues to move, the Temple Mount platform with the golden dome of the rock is seen. In the background, lights on the columns of a church across the road are visible. This marks the location of the Garden of Gethsemane and the Church of All Nations, east across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount. This lovely night vista ends as the camera pulls out for a quick look at the Mount of Olives. This view of the Temple Mount, with the Mount of Olives in the background, is from the northwest. The crowded Old City is clearly visible. The camera then provides a close-up of the Temple Mount platform, and specifically the gold Dome of the Rock, or, as it is sometimes called, the Mosque of Omar. This shrine, one of the most important in the Islamic world, was begun in 688 and finished in 691. Many Christians and Jews believe the structure stands where the Israelites' second temple was before its destruction by the Romans. The small dome, supported by 17 columns in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock, is called the Dome of the Chain. Its original purpose remains unclear, in spite of many legends that attempt to provide answers. The spotlighted Dome of the Rock, and behind, the lighted columns of the Church of All Nations, makes for a striking beginning to this clip. As dramatic as this scene is, the Mishnah reports that in Jesus' day, on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, 4 huge golden lampstands in the temple's court of the women were lit, and there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that did not reflect the light. The scene begins with a close view of the Dome of the Rock from the south. The camera pulls out to show the gray dome of the El-Aqsa Mosque and concludes with a view of the southern wall, southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, and the Western Wall and its plaza. In the foreground is the famous King David Hotel. The hotel was opened in 1931 and is popularly known as the temporary residence of visiting international dignitaries. The illuminated building with the tower is the more modest but equally well-known Jerusalem International YMCA, designed by Arthur Harmon, who also was the architect of the New York Empire State Building. It was completed in 1933, and when finished, was the tallest structure in Jerusalem. At that time, the YMCA boasted as having the only swimming pool in Jerusalem, as well as an 80-room hotel, numerous meeting and recreational facilities, a 25,000-volume library, and a carillon of 35 bells, the largest of which weighs over 1.5 tons. The camera pulls away to provide a lovely overview of the lights of Greater Jerusalem. On the right side are the illuminated walls that outline the Old City. The illuminated building is the King David Hotel. The King David Hotel, constructed of locally quarried pink sandstone, was opened in 1931. It has a fascinating history and has hosted many royalty, including King Abdullah I of Jordan, who arrived with a retinue on horses and camels. From 1931 to 1945, the hotel afforded asylum to 3 royal heads of state who fled their countries. This is the David Citadel Hotel, formerly the Jerusalem Hilton. Near here in 1860, English philanthropist Sir Moses Montefiore constructed some buildings and invited his fellow Jews to join him in order to escape the pressures of the old city. Thus, an entirely new city was begun, close to but outside the old city. This area now houses many of Israel's most important political, educational, and cultural institutions. This lovely Russian Orthodox Church is the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, consecrated in 1871. It was constructed by the Russian government outside the old city walls and inside a walled enclosure called the Russian Compound. The church's Renaissance-inspired architecture of bronze domes is modeled after the Kremlin's Cathedral of the Assumption. It is not far from the Jaffa Gate, near the northwest corner of the old city, and over a quarry for stones used in building the temple during Herod the Great's reign. Bet Hanassi, the home of Israel's president. The president is elected by the Knesset, or parliament, for a 5-year term and may serve a maximum of 2 terms. Since the Israeli governmental system is parliamentary, the president is not a part of the 3 branches of government and therefore has no political status. The residence was completed in 1971 and also consists of reception halls and offices. The building is constructed entirely of local materials, from pink-hued Iliat granite to golden Jerusalem stone. The exposed concrete surfaces are a common feature of 1960s and 1970s Israeli architecture. This building, housing Israel's parliament, the Knesset, was built in 1966. The square concrete structure is partially inlaid with Jerusalem stone and surrounded by 40 columns. The recess in the roof is over the plenary hall, where the 120 elected members meet. They serve 4-year terms. However, early elections may be and often are called. Modern Jerusalem can be seen in the background as the clip ends. Here, on the right side, is the main entrance to the Knesset, Israel's parliamentary building. In front of the pillars is the flickering eternal flame that commemorates soldiers who fell in the War of Independence. As the helicopter moves, the illuminated columns used to support the roof are seen. The camera pulls away to provide a lovely panorama of the lights of West Jerusalem. The helicopter flies over the Israel Museum complex and then focuses on the roof of a museum called the Shrine of the Book, located under the low structure with a cap-like dome. This dome is designed to resemble the lid of a large ancient ceramic jar, similar to the ones in which many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden in the 1st century A.D., until they were found in the 1940s and 50s. This building protects and displays many of those scrolls. The lighted building at the upper right is the Knesset, Israel's parliament building. The camera zooms down for a close look at the illuminated roof of the Shrine of the Book, home to the Dead Sea Scrolls that include some of the oldest Bible manuscripts in the world. Ever since their first discovery in 1947, the scrolls have evoked considerable interest among scholars and laymen alike. The clip ends with the camera zooming out for a look at the lights of West Jerusalem. With the Mount of Olives on the horizon in the distance, this is a panoramic vista of the buildings, apartments, and highways of modern Jerusalem, an area that is home to many of Israel's cultural, political, and educational facilities. Standing alone and seemingly out of place in the middle of contemporary West Jerusalem is the fortress-like Greek Orthodox edifice Monastery of the Holy Cross, first built here in the 5th century. The Monastery of the Cross, a Greek Orthodox facility, was first built in the 5th century and destroyed by the Parthians in 614. The current structure was built during the 11th century Crusader period by the Georgian king Bafrat on the site of the earlier sanctuary. The floor still contains sections of mosaics from the 5th century church. In Jerusalem, it is one of the finest examples of surviving Romanesque architecture, a transitional structural design developed during the 6th century that incorporates the earlier basilica style and some elements of the latter more complex Gothic. The dome is supported by 4 pillars, and the pillars and walls are decorated with frescoes dating to the 12th and 17th centuries. Many of the frescoes recount the legend of the tree used to make the cross upon which Jesus was crucified, thus the name of the monastery. Here, on this hilltop in the Judean hill country west of Jerusalem, is Israel's remembrance to the Holocaust of World War II, the Yad Vashem Memorial. The memorial and gardens were opened to the public in 1957. This solemn place commemorates the approximately 6 million Jews who were exterminated under the Nazi regime, as well as a tribute to the many non-Jews who risked or gave their lives in an effort to save European Jewry. West of the Yad Vashem Memorial and Jerusalem, in the heart of the Judean hills, is the Hadassah Hospital. It was opened in 1961 to replace one on Mount Scopus that became inaccessible after the War for Independence in 1948. The hospital's synagogue features 12 large stained glass windows depicting the blessing of Jacob on the 12 sons. In the distance, on the skyline, is modern Jerusalem.